Well, good morning, folks. Welcome to Tenable. I am Leslie Forbes with Tenable, and today we're going to talk about, well, the subject is threat intelligence through continuous monitoring. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye. We're going to skirt broadly around the challenges that face us. We are going to look at Shellshock as a case in point. It wasn't engineered by us, I promise, so that we could make good use of this webinar. It's fortuitous, in fact, that the webinar was planned a good while ago, and some nice material just happens to come up when we talk Shellshock. Indeed, we could even look back at Heartbleed and say the same thing. So with that in mind, let's take a little bit of a look back into time so that we can get an idea of where we're coming from. So there's a postulation that every 5 years or so, the order of magnitude, the number of systems that we deal with increases by an order of magnitude. So what we had 5 years ago, now we have 10 times more. And the reality is, even in our homes now, we're starting to talk about the so-called Internet of Things. And that even is relevant in our discussion of the Shellshock turbulence. So, stuff going into the cloud, going all the way back into these so-called monolithic mainframe type things. Over time, the point really is that every network is increasing in complexity, is increasing in the number of systems that need to be looked at. So when we consider how we're going to protect these things, that's the discussion in point. It's an ever-changing attack surface. So how are we going to go about trying to, you could say, build an arsenal of weapons against these things which constantly change? The reality is, you don't even know where next you're going to find some systems. And in fact, we talk regularly to customers and people who would like to get a better view on their systems and on their networks, and very often we hear, we're only scanning this and that and the next thing. We're only scanning our servers, or we only scan servers before they go into production. More and more, we start hearing, we don't know what's happening in that corner over there. We don't know when people deploy new systems. Even worse than that, we don't know when people are opening up new subnets. And very often, the reality is that the security folks are in a disadvantaged position because they're not aware of the changes, for example, that the network guys are making or that the system guys are making when they're building new systems. So what we're really trying to say here is periodic scanning is not enough. Some people might skirt around that and say, well, scan, and then when you finish scanning, scan again, and scan again, and scan again. But again, the reality is, in between those scans, what happens? If a scan takes several hours, or if you scan once a day even, and a scan takes an hour to complete, what happens in 23 hours? So it's kind of simple, really. Those scan windows that are very often considered sufficient are gradually becoming more and more insufficient. And if we think about it like this picture tells us a big story, because with all of those lights shining into dark space, you can see it's pretty clear that they're only going to give us so much visibility into where they're pointed. Now, if we consider that a scanner is like a light on the network, it's scanning a point in time, isn't it? So if we're pointing a scanner at a set of systems, at a network, at a subnet, at the entire enterprise, it can only see so much while it's targeting a particular IP. So What we're trying to say is, let's try and have a more strategic view of what's going on inside of our network, so that we can get a clearer perspective on what's actually there and what isn't there, so that we're trying to eliminate the so-called blind spot. Now, yes, we don't want to have, so could we say the Polaroid of network visibility? That's not going to help anybody. Yeah, it's fine to get a quick snapshot of what's going on there, and it's fine to be able to paint a clear picture of what all my systems look like as a static point in time, but just months afterwards, just with perhaps a bit of tweaking or a bit of knowledge about what's going on our network, that picture could change dramatically. And this whole Shellshock thing, calls into question people saying, well, where are all my systems? When it came to Heartbleed, people were saying, where are all of my SSL systems? And they thought that, well, they're all in the DMZ because they're hosting our websites. But it turns out that Heartbleed affected far, far more than that. And even if you cast your mind back 2.5 years, back to the RDP vulnerability, when that was announced by Microsoft, people were left standing on the back foot saying, where are all of these RDP servers? And if we have a consistent view of our network, then clearly we would have known what to look for and where to look. So if we'd been scanning all of our systems, whether passively or actively or continuously, if that's the moniker that we want to use here, we would have known where all those systems were. And then it's just a matter of pulling them out one by one and saying, you're patched, you're patched, you're patched. And the same scenario exists right today. That's the key message here really, is you can't protect what you don't know. And I'll say it again, you can't protect what you don't know. SANS control number one. If anybody's following that, it's fairly common in the security industry right now. Know your systems. And even in the explanation to SANS control number one, they mention the effectiveness of passive scanning for systems. So really, that's kind of what we're trying to say here is, for effective defense, for effective cyber defense, this is what's going to give us the edge on people knowing about what's in our network before we do. And how often don't we hear that? Well, it was a little system stuck in the background there. I didn't know that it was there. And wouldn't it be terrible if somebody knew more about my network than what I did? So SANS control number one, it's a great starting point. I mean, the first four SANS controls, massively effective in defending our networks. What it gives to us is a very clear need to have an inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices. So how are we going to distinguish the difference? Well, that's up to the network administrators, isn't it? Ultimately, what it's saying is, just put this tool out there, so get some asset inventory thing, just be sure you're going to do it properly, and make sure that you're going to be using some passive stuff there. So really, what we're trying to say as a vendor is that we discover 100% of assets continuously. So what that really means is, without taking a broad swathe of network space and scanning it, which is the sort of 5-year-old mentality, maybe 10 years old, is just go and scan these things. That's not sufficient anymore. What happens in IPv6 networks? Well, nobody has successfully scanned, and it's just not feasible to scan a range of IPv6 addresses. How are we going to discover those things? How are we going to go and target them for proper perspective on what their configuration is, for example? So, all of those are challenges that are facing security professionals across the globe. It's not just in very special networks or guys who've adopted IPv6. It's here right now. We need to be aware of that stuff. Most 99% of systems all have IPv6 capability, and a very large percentage of those even have that capability turned on. So that's really what we want to try and do. And this is what I was trying to say earlier on, with the previous slide of the light shining out there. Let's try and eliminate all of these black spots. Shine a light on shadow IT. You can't manage stuff if you don't know exactly where it is, or exactly how it is, or exactly what shape it is. And the same applies to Wi-Fi and all these kind of BYOD concepts. So we would consider, how would you put it? We would consider a scenario where sorry, I wanted to go back a page. I've lost a slide. Oh, odd. Anyway, we would consider that when we're talking about where people use systems, we want to know what the systems are doing, what they're transferring, what data they're using, where that data is. So you can consider all of your information and my information, corporate user lists, corporate strategy, all those kind of things, all silos of data. And it's how we access those silos of data that's of real importance to defining how we're going to manage the threat against that data set. So, in the old days, it was just very simply, well, we'll just put a firewall around that thing. But nowadays, I think most people understand that that is by far nowadays insufficient because of the proliferation of the persistence of data everywhere, and I need it all the time. I'm not going to go into the office just to go and access the presentation that I'm going to give tomorrow. So I need to have that in my cloud somewhere. So it's a lot more than just managing vulnerabilities. Yes, vulnerability management is crucial to the integrity of the systems. But what we're saying is there's a lot more to securing systems than just vulnerability management. What we'd like to be able to show is that there are controls in place, and we'd like to be able to audit them. We'd like to be able to manage them. We'd like to be able to measure them. How are we certain when we've defined a set of parameters, a set of policies? How are we certain that they're being enforced or adopted, or in fact, whether they're being abused? So the scenario could be, well, in the corporate network, we don't allow cloud file sharing, a la Dropbox. But it turns out that on the visitor network, that's completely possible. So it's not a problem for me to take my laptop and disconnect from the corporate network, attach to the visitor network, do my file sharing, and come back in without even leaving my desk. Well, that's a circumvention, isn't it? So how are we going to monitor that? That's the challenge. It's a challenge. So what we're actually saying is, when it comes to managing users, when it comes to managing silos of data, when it comes to managing the threat against them, we want to know about everything. Yes, it's fine to have firewalls up. It's fine to have antivirus in place and DLP and all that kind of thing. But when it comes to mobiles, where are things then? Are we managing it that way? Are we looking at users? How are we checking whether systems are configured correctly? Those are all measurement points that need to be attached to a security solution. There's this capability of building in these metric points to say, well, 90% of my systems are all locked down against Dropbox or whatever social thing we're talking about, which is the flavor of the day. Patch validation obviously is the most basic of all of these, which is why it starts at the bottom. But it shouldn't just have a negative space there. not by any stretch. So these are all just ways that we have of being able to highlight where there are gaps in the strategy, gaps in the defenses, holes in the walls, so to speak. And when I'm an IT manager, I want to know about that stuff. Well, you could say before anything dramatic happens that causes us to need to take drastic action as opposed to remedial or strategic action. But that would be a really nice place to be in if we're looking at it from the point of view of nice, simple ways of dealing with things. So how are we going to deal with it next? This is how we'd like to come at it, is when we've got all of our patching in place, when we've got all of our compliance checking in place, what we'd like to know about is where these indicators of compromise are. How do they look? What shape do they take? And as a very cool example of exactly this challenge, well, perhaps now is a good time to talk about this Shellshock thing. So if we consider that Shellshock was big news just a week ago, and people were saying, well, okay, so how am I going to go and find these things now? Well, okay, well, we've got a scanner in place. A large number of people know and love Nessus. There are other scanners out there which can do similar things. And what we're going to do is we're going to point this at our systems and just go and scan for Shellshock. Now, as luck would have it, not luck really, it's by design, Tenable has built plugins to detect Shellshock within hours of the knowledge of Shellshock being made known. So, well, people would take the scanner and go and scan. But now, what is Shellshock? What is it? It's this bash thing, right? It's the shell. It's the shell that is present on just about any Unix system, the command line in Windows speak. But it's a particular type of command line, because there are different types of command line inside of Unix systems. I might like one, others might like another. So the problem was, inside of bash in particular, in a particular version, or earlier versions of bash up to 4.3, as we all know, there was a problem. That problem manifested itself by having variables stored inside of, you could say, memory, and that being used by arbitrary programs. Now, the most obvious would have been web shells, web scripts. So things like PHP, CGI, Perl, etc., mod CGI, etc., etc. Now, people were saying, all right, well, I'm going to go and scan all my systems. As it happens, that might not be the most effective way, because, well, we've got to understand how those systems are being used. So the story of that is, perhaps if I'd gone in using credentials into a target system and scanned it to see what the version is of bash that's installed on my system, and you could even go further than that and go and audit whether bash is enabled as the login script for the system, I would have a high value certainty of whether that is the case. Just randomly scanning a website does not give me the certainty. So what I'm trying to say really is, there's a high scope or a high probability of touching systems that have got bash problems or that use bash just by scanning them using an external scanner. In other words, touching all of the IPs that are on my network, but a low probability of actually finding something. The opposite is also true. If I'm not aware of all the systems, but I am scanning systems that are within my, shall I say, asset lists, sure, there'll be a high probability of finding the version of bash, but a low probability of actually finding them all. So how are we going to try and bring these numbers level? Well, with continuous monitoring is, again, the secret. What I'm saying is, if we were aware of all of the systems, go back to SANS control number 1 that I mentioned 10 minutes ago, if we were monitoring for all the systems on our network and we knew that some of those were Unixy systems, Bash, Linux, Solaris, AIXs, all of those kind of things, if I knew that they were there, then I'd be able to scan them. So how do I know they're there? Passively detecting them. And that's, again, part of the SANS control number 1. Use passive scanners to detect things as they come and go from the network. Use passive scanners to identify types of systems. Use passive scanners to identify programs that are running on those systems, in the case of user agents, for example. So, those are just interesting points. Now, how do I make good use of that stuff? Well, inside of Tenable Security Center, we've got the capability to automatically tag systems. So what I would say is create a dynamic approach to say, as soon as you see something that's a Unix box, well, go and touch it. Label it as Unix. And then what I can go and do then is simply scan that thing. Now I know far more than I did previously by scanning just that little subnet that an IT manager told me about. So where am I finding indicators of compromise in this scenario? Well, very simply, one of the other extensions to Security Center is this capability to deliver dashboards. And of course, there'll be a dashboard for Shellshock. So what we're saying is, yes, we've got all of this scanning capability, and you might not have even attempted to scan. With a particular policy, you might have a generic scan all policy, and still this would work because those newer plugins are adopted continuously. So every new scan that happens will bring information back. So really, that's what it really boils down to. Indicators of compromise are things that are mounting up, and what we're doing is trying to count them. We're trying to measure them. Dashboards have the capability of looking deep into our data sets and summarizing all of that information. Think of it as an analytics platform. Think of Security Center as something that is your backstop. When you can't think of the next simple way to achieve something, well, you can almost be certain that somebody's asked for it before and that there'll be a dashboard. Now, Shellshock is a case in point. Heartbleed was a case in point. Within 2 days of Heartbleed being around, there was a dashboard. Within 1 day, within hours of Heartbleed being made known, there were plugins. So people were scanning already. How do we summarize all that information? Shove it on a dashboard. We've got other dashboards also, which summarize indicators of compromise very, very nicely. So whether it's routine scanning of my firewall, whether it's attempted password breaches, whether it's somebody trying to go through via IPS and IDS solutions deep into other things, there are indicators of compromise that help us with that. How do we track those things? Well, with logging. So logging is the cornerstone that we haven't yet talked about. We've been talking about continuous monitoring, but logging forms part of that. Continuous monitoring means capture every log that comes out of somewhere and just store it away. What we're doing is not just storing it away, but we're post-processing that log and saying, well, perhaps there's some useful information there that we can gather. If we see too many of a particular thing, well, we'll summarize that and say, well, actually, we've seen some suspicious behavior. Perhaps there have been inside of a system some or other executable going off and saying, well, okay, I've got free reign on this system. It might not be detected by antivirus because I know that somebody uses, one of the popular, for McAfee, Symantec, Sophos, F-Secure, whatever, Trend Micro, ESET, whatever. We know that people try and avoid those things because with an APT, I'll know what you're using. I'm going to go ahead and target you. what Tenable is able to do is dig deep into those things and say, well, okay, let's take that hash and go and compare it with all of the known antivirus vendors via a clever bunch called reversing labs. So you can do interesting things like that. What we also try and look at using this passive monitoring technology is to try and understand who's trusting whom, who's talking to whom across all of these sways of the internet. So ultimately what we're trying to say is, let's get a handle on everything that's being done inside of my network under whatever context. What we might also want to know is try and understand where things have been suspicious. So perhaps Joe logging in via a VPN at midnight is very uncharacteristic of him. If that's the first time we've seen him logging in from Cambodia, well, then we'd like to know about that sort of thing. That's all part of this continuous nature of monitoring systems. It's not all just about scanning. It's not all just about sniffing. It's all about capturing everything you possibly can from all of these silos of data, from all of the accesses to all of those silos. That's what we're trying to get at. When we discover unexpected auto-runs deep inside of a system, when we've gone in there as an administrator using credentials, well, that's what we want to know. We want to tie that in to what goes inside of our data set, so that when we look at it as indicators of compromise, we would know where they came from. We would know that they're there in the first place. So there's a terrific amount more to could you say what meets the eye when you consider just vulnerability management? Are we all patched up? Have we deployed last month's Microsoft bulletins? Well, perhaps we have, but that alone is not going to tell me whether I have a botnet in my business. It's not going to tell me whether somebody has brought in a compromised machine into the network. Not even an IPS will tell me that, because this machine's talking out. And more often than not, IPSs are configured for traffic coming in. So all of these are very, very clear points in time that we want to try and look at how we're gathering all of this kind of info. We want to look at what the possibilities are of having a variety of sources of data to help us get a handle on what's going on inside the network. So I've mentioned a bunch of different tools that we use to gather all of this data. Some of you might be familiar with some of these tools, and others might not. So let's just go around here very quickly. I've mentioned Security Center on a number of occasions. So Security Center is the analytics platform, I'd like to say, of all of this data that we're capturing, and it's slicing and dicing that data so that me as a risk manager get the right view. John as an operations manager, he can get his view. And the security operations guys, well, they can get their view. All of the data that comes in here is all centralized and managed, and we've got all of these different dashboards. That one that I showed you about Shellshock is one clear example, but there are many others that are beautifully supplied and presented for, well, whoever wants to consume them in whichever way. So I've mentioned Nessus being the core scanner of what we do, and the capability of Security Center is to enable multiple Nessus scanners to be deployed across pretty much any corner of my network, so that when I want to go and scan those targets behind that scanner, I can scan them when I want and deliver the right information back at the right point in time, and so on. Now, PVS, passive vulnerability scanner, in the same way can be deployed where I want it and when I want it. Yes, clearly we want it to be operating 24/7 because that's what it does. It sniffs all the traffic. It's a passive scanner. It has rules, just like Nessus has rules and plugins, to listen to different types of traffic and identify perhaps where somebody is shoving traffic down port 443 when actually that traffic should be SSL traffic, or TLS should I be saying. You know, things like that. So then I mentioned log in the corner up the top there. Log correlation engine takes all of the logging events that it gets sent, maybe by syslog, maybe by log correlation agents, and indeed by passive itself. So the passive scanner, when it detects certain things, it's able to generate logs. So can you see how all three of these, together with Security Center, present us with a continuous monitoring solution? Beautiful. Nessus Enterprise Cloud in the corner there does form part of this, but doesn't have to form part of this. And it depends whether you want a scanner in the cloud and whether that scanner is tied into your Security Center in order to make it part of the solution too. Clearly, it forms part of what I said was the point-in-time scan capability for scanning my, could I say, front-end websites and so on. But what's beautiful about that is that it can help me with my visibility against what hackers can see and know about my business versus what I know and see about my business. So let's try and summarize it all. Tenable lead the way in passive asset and vulnerability discovery. So what we're out to do is just enable companies to have full visibility of their networks all the time. That's what we're out to do, and we're making good headway in that. And what we'd like to be able to do is chat with you some more. I appreciate all of your time and attention this morning. And if you do want to have a chat with me, feel free to fire me an email. Browse our website. Obviously, there's tons of stuff on blog. Indeed, one of the really cool articles, which is the latest on the blog, is how to track Shellshock using log correlation and process monitoring. A really, really cool little article there. Obviously, we do some podcasting, and there are videos, lots of videos on YouTube for tracking what we're up to and what we do and so on. So let's go ahead and field any questions. I haven't looked yet to see whether anybody's fired any questions, but I'm pretty certain that people have questions relating to what we've been talking about today. If there are some things which are more, what's the right word, oblique to what we're talking here, I'm happy to field those too. Fire me an email, and we're more than happy to support you guys. So when it comes to evaluating, fire us evaluation requests. We'd love to get in contact with you all and facilitate all of these kind of challenges. So let's have a look here at some questions. Yeah, can I use passive vulnerability scanner as a standalone tool, just like I use Nessus as a standalone tool? Oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. So passive vulnerability scanner now has a front end, which is very similar to the Nessus front end. And in fact, the results are interchangeable. So I can download my passive scan results and import them into my Nessus scanner. And indeed, the intention is to have Nessus and passive results being imported routinely into the Security Center so that we can use that as an analytics platform. Here's another one. Okay, so back onto the Shellshock question. Do we need credentials? Absolutely, yes. So the best way, our advised way to go discovering Shellshock is to absolutely do an authenticated local security check on your target platforms. So whether they're Red Hat, whether they're SUSE, whether they're CentOS or whatever, the best way of all is to make good use of the knowledge of what the Nessus scanner can find inside of those target systems by using SSH credentials to go and log in and enumerate the actual patch status of those systems. How do you know whether that thing is using DHCP, whether it's using some other kind of funky scriptlets inside? I think that while you might be able to find stuff using web scanning, because that was the sort of, what would you say, the first part of the message was go and scan all your web servers. Yes, you might be able to find stuff that way, but there might be a plethora of other capabilities which are making good use of Dash, and we're oblivious to it unless we go and find those systems which are using vulnerable Bash. So, key message, scan with credentials. How do you do that? Oh, okay. So when you log into Nessus and try and create, or not try, when you go and create a new policy, well, it's very simple. Go ahead and create a new policy, and then the little wizard section will pop up, and there's a special wizard in there now for Shellshock. That wizard will ask you for SSH credentials, and what you simply do is supply your username and password for the target systems, and it'll go ahead and log in. In Security Center, it's a little bit more involved because of the fact that it's an enterprise system and stores those credentials in an encrypted format. So what we'll do is we'll store the credentials ahead of time, create the scan policy, and use those credentials inside of the scan job, together with the scan policy, to go and scan our targets. Anyone else? Yeah, so where does all the logging come from? So I mentioned it only once, but I did say that log correlation engine takes syslog, much like any other log system takes syslog. And those syslogs typically will come from routers, switches, printers, Linux boxes, Unix boxes, so on. Now, there's also another source of logging, because clearly Windows systems are prolific, and that by default they don't have syslog. So we have a log correlation client/agent, which you can install on that target system or systems, and those agents feed logs directly into the log correlation engine. Passive vulnerability scanner also issues syslog, which goes into the log correlation engine. And all of these together are a continuous flow of event data. There's one very cool and very often overlooked client inside of the log correlation engine toolkit, all of which are free when you're an LCE customer, by the way, called Tenable Network Monitor, which is like a super-powered NetFlow monitor. All it's doing is grabbing a hold of the network traffic, summarizing it, and sending that summary to log correlation engine. What I mean by summary is connection information, source destination ports. We'll be able to derive length of connection from that kind of information. It'll even pull out traffic that we can see there. So it's a very cool way of finding, you could say, syslog data where syslog's not pointed at us, for example. So that's just a very simple way of a source of data. Blogging on log, that's one of the next questions. There are fewer blog articles or fewer YouTube articles on log, and I'll take that one on board and feed that back to our YouTubers so that we can enhance that. So yeah, that is a slightly less populated area on how to do some really cool log analysis. But as I mentioned, the very latest blog article under tenable.com/blog is the one about Shellshock and how you can use logging to track indicators of compromise on Shellshock. So I have to thank you. We're coming up to 45 minutes, and I have to thank you very much for your time, for your attention, and for all the questions. It's been a great session, and look forward to meeting all of you guys at some point. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.